If you draw a line from the top of the triangle down, that trend of oppression is called heterosexism. What this means is that heterosexual privilege polices how we look at sexual relationships and sex and gender as to who gets the power and who doesn't. So if we were to pick a heterosexist society like the United States, who would have the most power?
Straight couples.
Straight people, and specifically straight couples. Although, I think it's important to mention, you can have single straight people. It's very hard to be a single bisexual person. Usually bisexuals are deemed existing based on the person they are dating. So if they're dating someone of the same sex or gender, then we either call them gay or lesbian. And if they're dating someone of the opposite, whatever opposite means, of sex and gender, then we would call them heterosexual. But if they're single, it's really challenging for them to be like, no, I'm bisexual, I promise, I'm just single. But in a heterosexist society, straight people get to be single, and they get to be couples. So that's important to note. So anything not perceived as straight is seen as the subordinated group. Now, where those two intersect, right? This is why we blame straight men for everything. Because that intersects those two pieces of privilege, straight men. If you want to add in race or Christianity, so like white straight men, Christian white straight men, right? You can add in all these different levels of dominance. You can also have subordinated or marginalized identities. But it's important to understand that in that simultaneity of multiple identities, some of them are dominant, some of them are subordinated, but at that intersection is where power and privilege police sex, gender, and sexual identity. So that's kind of the review of the model. And when I started using this, the idea was for everyone to be able to find themselves. So I identify as a woman. Anyone out there in the audience who identifies as a woman, it is possible that your definition of a woman does not involve having a giant orange stripe in your very short hair. Right? I do identify as a woman with an orange stripe in my hair. So the reason why I use it as an example is that all of us that identify as women, we chose how we were going to express ourselves today. We work through our roles and our relationships to express our identities. When we start looking within single-gendered organizations, sometimes we call that sisterhood, or we call that bonding. Or we call that a special thing that those other people can't have. They can't share that. And what I think is really important when we start talking about the conversation around trans inclusion, it is to notice that in this conversation, I'm not recommending that anything be taken away or any sacred space be opened up and made public. What I'm suggesting by beginning the conversation specifically within fraternities and sororities, single-gendered organizations, single-gendered institutions, is I think it's important for us all to be mindful of what practices and protocols we are using that are based on judgments and assumptions when things might actually be more complicated than we're prepared to deal with. By beginning those conversations, I think we can have better definitions of what it means to be a sister or what it means to be a brother, and what promises we have to keep in order to stay and maintain our sisterhood and our brotherhood. The work that I've done within fraternities and sororities, a lot of organizations are just starting to have the conversations. So one of the first pieces that I'm starting to do is to acknowledge that you probably, statistically speaking, have not straight people in your organization already. You also, statistically speaking, probably have someone who has transitioned, who is a member of your organization or who's on your campus. You just might not know about it because they don't feel safe to tell you. And as a sorority member, I made a lifelong commitment to my sisters to live to a higher standard. And to me, there's nothing more sad than a sister who doesn't feel like they can tell me or doesn't feel like they can trust me with who they really are. That's why I started having these conversations. When Sarah Fielding and I started the research for the Beginning the Conversation Guide, we conducted about 65 different interviews, one of which was with Eileen. And I'll kind of end with this story and then open it up to the panel and to questions within the group. But Eileen graduated from a prestigious research institution in Pennsylvania in 1951. By 1953, she was living full-time as a woman and was still an active alumni member of her fraternity. To this day, she has donated money and time using the internet to mentor new members of her fraternity. For living as a man for 24 years, she actually accredits the values of her fraternity to teaching her how to be the kind of woman she is today. What's challenging for her and me is that she is not out as a trans woman within her fraternity or her brothers. It will be upon her death, when her estate is bequeathed to the national office of her fraternity, that her fraternity brothers will find out the truth about Eileen. It is my commitment to at least help people have a conversation instead of waiting until it's too late. Nobody is doing this perfectly. I will say the work that I've done within Gamma Alpha Omega and other NALFO sororities are probably the most progressive steps and conversations I've been a part of around trans inclusion. We have a long, long way to go. So I appreciate you coming tonight. I appreciate you listening to my model in the air and looking at my giant face. And I'll pause there and kind of see where the conversation goes. So.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay, so just a couple of That was lovely. Okay, so just a couple of conversation starters. Obviously, you all have resources, and there should be the definition of transgender in there. And just laying it out, the definition of transgender is someone who identifies with the broad spectrum of gender outside the binary system of male or female. This is a very big umbrella term, so there's a lot of little things, and you can see that's probably the first page in your packet, the trans umbrella, just kind of explaining different levels of transgender that there can be. So just getting that definition out there, and we'll move on. A question to start off of. Why is it important, for the panelists, why is it important for people to educate themselves on this subject?
I think that it's important that people educate themselves on the trans community, because I think as we progress as a society, it comes out a lot more often. You know, I'm going to use Ches Bono as an example, that, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, I don't think maybe half the nation knew to an extent about what transgender was. I'm sure if you went to Montana, people wouldn't know what that meant, you know? So I think that it's really kind of brought up to a national conversation, and I think that it's very important that people educate themselves on it before, you know, results of ignorance happens.
Echoing that and some of what Jess said, we all know transgender people, whether we know that they're transgender or not. So being able to have these conversations, being able to educate ourselves and each other, and continue to learn is really going to help us be better supporters and better friends and better allies to people that we know.
I would say that it's really important to start the educational piece because as we are trying to create a society that is more inclusive of everyone, that if the first time that we hear about transgender is when someone comes to talk to us about it, we may not handle that the best way. So if we're able on the front end to have gotten the educational resources and to at least have a broad awareness of it, then we can help make that a more comfortable situation for them if it's our sister or if it's our brother or if it's someone else within our community. So I think the educational piece allows us to be more supportive so that this is a process where someone can feel that they can truly be themselves regardless of how they identify.
And I think also going off of that, like as a sorority woman and someone in college, it's something, at Millikin we really strive for diversity. We do a lot of exercises to familiarize ourselves with what that means. But I think people tend to look at diversity as black and white and like really, really there's a fine line between what diversity really is. But like for me, I think that like transgender people are people and we're all people and we all live in the same world, in the same community.